As the global economy hits peak oil demand, the question arises, what will happen to countries, Petro-states we call them, that rely primarily on oil and gas for to fund their government. So Carbon Tracker out of the UK has just released a study on this topic, and I'm going to talk to Alex Dalman about it. Welcome to the interview, Alex.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Well, look, why don't we start with a brief overview of your study, please?
Sure. So, as you said, the world is rapidly decarbonizing, or it's looking like it's heading in that direction, clearly. And that's going to have a lot of positive impacts on the world, obviously, in terms of mitigating climate change, creating cheaper sources of energy for people, less pollution, so on and so forth. A lot of benefits, but of course, a lot of trade-offs as well. And especially, as I say, for countries that rely heavily on earnings from fossil fuels currently. And so what we wanted to do in this report was to quantify that impact. If the world goes to a much lower fossil fuel demand future, what does that mean for the revenues that countries are earning from extracting fossil fuels today? And we were focusing on oil and gas in this report. And what we really wanted to quantify was, what does this mean for countries that rely the most on these resources? Because obviously there's a lot of countries that export and produce oil and gas. And globally, we see the governments all over the world stand to lose $13 trillion in a low carbon future compared to a sort of industry expectations or business as usual pathway. But of course, for countries that rely heavily on these revenues, that's going to matter a lot more. And so that's what this study really wanted to focus on.
So you mentioned other countries, so Canada, for instance, the United States, the UK, Norway, all of those export a lot of oil and gas and earn a considerable revenue, but it doesn't dominate their economies the way it does for Azerbaijan, for instance, which is on your list of foreign petro-states. So what is the impact on these smaller countries that rely so heavily on oil and gas?
Yeah, I mean, the problem that we're focusing on in this report is that the governments are relying so heavily on the earnings from oil and gas to fund basic services and basic investments in the economy. The Canadian government, for example, taxes its citizens and the non-oil economy in a way that it doesn't have to rely so much on the oil price cycle to determine the budget. But for a country like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Nigeria, the oil price goes down. That means you have to cut services, you have to cut spending on health and education and essential investments. And so that's really the problem that they're facing, is that not just for a few years when the oil prices are low and then they come back up, but actually for the future, the foreseeable future, they're going to have to live with much weaker revenues, and they have to find new places to source that revenue.
And I would imagine that small countries like that have far fewer resources to fund some kind of an energy transition to a more electricity-based economy. Are there any, international agencies, that sort of thing, that are assisting them with the transition? Well,
look, I mean, so the question of diversification is not a new one, and this has been an issue on international policymakers' minds for decades. And for the governments of these countries as well, I should say. It's not that this is a completely new concept for them. They've been talking about this for decades. The problem is that it's been a question of becoming more resilient to cycles, to changes in cycles and temporary shifts in prices, rather than a long-term shift in prices. And so I think that's slowly happening, but it's only in the last 5 or 10 years that people have really started taking the energy transition seriously. And so it's no wonder that policymakers haven't really caught up. But I think that's something we're going to see in the next few years very, very strongly, that in organizations like the IMF and the World Bank will start talking about this a lot more and start integrating that into their policy advice a lot more.
Now, I've interviewed Tony Seba a number of times on video and for our podcast, and he argues that wind, solar, and batteries are going to be so cheap by 2030 that it will transform societies and economies the same way that cheap petroleum and the internal combustion engine did during the 1920s. if Tony is correct, and even if he's off by a few years, but if he's fundamentally correct in that argument, that would suggest that these smaller countries, if they were given some sort of assistance to move to an electricity-based economy, electricity-based industries, this might be the strategy to get them, wean them off oil and gas revenues. Is any of that sort of approach being contemplated?
Yeah, look, I mean, many of these countries are, in the global south, and they obviously have huge potential to utilize these types of renewable sources, like solar, for example. In many of these countries, that's a huge untapped resource. And if you think in the Middle East, I mean, the sun never stops shining. So it's obviously a huge opportunity for them. I think that will be one part of the solution for them, but it's only going to be one small part because, of course, a clean energy system is going to be a huge source of competitive advantage, but they also have to do so many other things like change their tax systems and reduce spending to be able to earn more money off of the non-oil economy. And they need to be able to find, to build up parts of the economy that can create export revenue and replace that from the fossil fuel industry. So I think there's definitely a huge scope to sort of leapfrog and to go directly into a renewable energy system, and that's going to be very, very, very positive for these countries. But it's only going to be one part of the solution for them, and they're going to need a big sort of portfolio of solutions to go with it.
I suppose that makes perfect sense to me because there are issues like banking systems and education. Do you have enough trained scientists and other technical workers? I mean, this is a very complex kind of problem, and these are small countries that don't have a lot of resources and capability and capacity to make that kind of transition. Any final thoughts on the study, Alex?
Yeah, look, I think what you just mentioned, I think, speaks to the importance of the rest of the world pitching in and helping these countries. Many of them will need the assistance of the developed world, if you will, and that we have a lot to give to these countries in terms of policy advice and sort of technical support. And so I think it's in everyone's interest also to help these countries, because if we're going to solve the climate crisis, it's not enough for Europe to do its bit. The whole world has to decarbonize and has to become fossil fuel free. And so I think it's important that everyone wakes up to that reality.
Alex, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.